Well, that's what Petra Bartosiewicz does when she writes for this month's Harpers magazine, The Intelligence Factory, How America Makes Its Enemies Disappear. Petra, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You made a decision to dig into a very complicated issue, and you went an incredible distance to actually understand this story. Talk to me about why you wrote this.
Well, I've been following terrorism trials in the U.S. For the last couple of years. I'm working on a book on the subject, and this is probably one of the most complex cases that I've encountered. I didn't realize how complicated it was when I started reporting, but it turned out to be a huge mystery because it's basically a story about a disappearance of this woman, Aafia Saddiqui, who went missing for 5 years in Pakistan and then reappeared under very bizarre circumstances last year in Afghanistan. But as I looked sort of more closely at the story, it really was more about how we gather intelligence in the war on terrorism and how we build these cases.
It was very strange for me as I followed this because it starts out with this sort of almost aristocratic young woman, I mean, at least relatively speaking, in Pakistan, who ends up in the United States, PhD, MIT, and other things, and then somehow ends up on a street in Afghanistan. She gets picked up. I mean, this is a really, really weird story. Can you give us sort of a basic overview of who Aafia Saddiqui is, and then we can go from there?
Yeah, sure. She is, as you say, she was MIT educated. She's a neuroscientist, and she lived in the U.S. for over a decade and raised a family here. 2 of her children are actually born in the USA, and shortly after 9/11, she went back to Pakistan. She traveled back and forth a bit, and she then disappeared in 2003 in Karachi, which is her hometown, and at the time, she was sort of suspected of perhaps being an al-Qaeda operative. About a year after she vanished, the FBI actually said that she might be an al-Qaeda operative. But there were really no formal accusations leveled against her. She was just kind of implicated she was connected to a lot of different people. And then 5 years go by, and she's found in Ghazni, Afghanistan, which is in the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan. It's about 150 miles south of Kabul, the capital. And she's got with her a whole bunch of documents and chemicals and a thumb drive, which allegedly contains some targeting information. And she's the crime she's actually accused of right now. She's accused of trying to shoot her way out of custody, basically, and she's going to face trial here in the United States probably sometime next year. It looks like.
But does this make any sense though? Because you actually start to dig into this yourself. You go in. You actually hire a local investigator in Afghanistan. You go to Pakistan. You start looking at this, and this just isn't as simple as the American prosecutors make it out to be.
Well, it definitely isn't, because the whole story about this case is everything but what you'll see in the trial that she's facing. What happened when she vanished, she actually is a very famous person in Pakistan and in a lot of the Middle East. She's become kind of a cause celeb because she's become a symbol of a lot of people who sort of fall off the radar and vanish as part of this global war on terrorism. And whether or not she was on the run during the 5 years she was missing, or whether she was picked up by U.S. intelligence or Pakistani intelligence, we don't know that for sure, but she's become a symbol of these sort of disappeared people that are suspected to have been picked up by usually Pakistani intelligence on the ground, but some of them certainly at the behest of the United States or the UK. And this is kind of another frontier of the global war on terror, because we've seen, especially since the Obama administration, an increasing number of revelations about where people were kept and under what conditions, and now officially the black sites are closed. But proxy detention is something that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage up to now, and that certainly is another way to get information out of people, is to have other countries pick them up for you.
Well, we'll come back to Aafia Saddiqui in just a moment, but let's look at this question of these disappeared people. We think about what President Obama is even doing right now. I remember being at the White House when we started hearing about all of the transparency that was going to come out of this White House, and then, of course, the photos of Abu Ghraib. They weren't going to release those, and then we find that rendition was still something that the Obama administration would continue to support. Then we hear about more close relationships between our intelligence service and Pakistani ISI and other organizations. It seems to me that this idea of the disappeared is something that we're just well and good with still.
Well, there's a lot of debate about that, especially among human rights organizations. Some believe that it's not happening anymore, but the fact that renditions are still on the table means that people are being picked up by foreign intelligence services, and there's a lot of there's a distancing from the interrogation if you have somebody else doing it for you, if you're passing the questions along. But certainly, if you are asking foreign intelligence services to help you with these kinds of things, then they're going to be using whatever tactics are familiar to them. And we know for a fact that Pakistan employs some very brutal techniques when they're interrogating people in their custody. And certainly due process issues are not much of a concern in Pakistan, as we know from many, many reports. And this predates even 9/11.
Well, this is obviously a concern, because even if we pull back from the rendition issue, which is when the Americans would pick up somebody in a country, say Italy, Sweden, or elsewhere, and then they'll take them to a third country. This was a perfect example of, we were following the story of these some dozen or 2 dozen CIA officers